lights went out in Crimson Hill on Halloween. The lights went out in Crimson Hill on Halloween. No one spoke at first. The town simply exhaled, and the sound went thin. Mara learned the town's rhythms as a child. Porch lights dosed at 9, the bell at dusk, street lamps that tilted and hummed. She had come back to pack a house, to touch the edges of a life that felt like someone else's film. When the hum faltered that night, the ordinary seams of the town showed. Things that had been invisible against steady light sat suddenly sharp and wrong. At first it was practical. Candles came from drawers. Flashlights coughed awake. Elias knocked and offered a battery that smelled like old coal, his face half in shadow. He spoke of the grid like someone speaking of an ailing animal, an explanation, a memory, a warning. The neighbors clustered in pockets of candlelight, conversations small and practical, until someone said the town always did this on certain nights, sometimes for minutes, sometimes until dawn. The word sometimes folded the room into itself. People swallowed it and looked out into the street. Mara walked the block that night because the dark made everything feel honest. Without the ordinary glare, the town resembled an old photograph. Edges softened, contrasts exaggerated. Window silhouettes moved like punctuation, and each pane seemed to hold someone waiting with a sentence unfinished. She felt watched by the town itself, not by people, by its patterns and omissions. Her camera, usually a companion, felt heavy with expectation. She caught one photograph of a dark street, and later, when she developed it in the bathroom sink, discovered a smear that might be a shadow or a reflection. The ledger found her the next morning, or perhaps she found it in the way one finds a name on a list one had been avoiding. It was tucked beneath a tarpaulin in the attic, paper swelled with damp and handwriting, cramped as if conserving ink and memory. Inside, dates clustered around Octobers, shorthand notes times. Margins held sketches of globes and bell towers, arrows that bent back toward the hill. There were jotted lines that read like a rhythm, 3 rings, a pause, then nothing. As Mara read, a sensation rose in her that the book was less a record than a conversation with a thing the town did not discuss. Elias came by the shop where she kept a week's worth of boxes and spoke in the measured sentences his neighbors trusted. He admitted he had made notes. 2 times he'd fixed a fuse, times he'd checked the transformer. He said, as if reading a necessary line, that sometimes the town needed to look away. He did not elaborate. Mara watched him press his fingertips to the page where she'd laid the ledger, his knuckles like calloused keys turning in a closed lock. The implication lodged itself between them. Someone or something had learned when to make darkness useful. Rumors grew like mold in corners, stories of windows that kept their own hours, of people who kept to bed when the town breathed low. A neighbor mentioned a name she couldn't place. Another said the bell had stopped once, for longer than any remembered life. The ledger suggested a rhythm, lines of dates that sometimes matched births and funerals, sometimes did not. Once, Mara thought she found a page where someone had written, in a different hand, "We put it to sleep after the accident." The ink had bled. The sentence ended like a question, without a mark. On the next Halloween, the town held its breath differently. People stayed indoors, whose houses usually brimmed with passers-by. The bell tolled at dusk, 3 rings into a fog that swallowed the third, and then a hush spread like a velvet curtain. Mara noticed the windows more than usual. Black panes became monuments. From one across the street, a silhouette lingered, as though in the act of stepping back from the glass. The movement was too smooth, too patient to be startled. It watched the watchfulness and learned from it, as if the town's gaze taught new manners to the dark. That night, Mara walked to the power box because the ledger's arrows seemed to point. The enclosure sat like a patient animal at the hill's base. Stickers faded, a faint hum beneath its heavy lid. The lock was not forced, but left in a way that suggested habitual opening. Inside, rows of breakers like vertebrae sat in alignment. Mara hesitated at the smell, ozone, and old metal. She wanted to flip something, to break the pattern. But standing there, with the ledger under her arm, felt like standing at a bedside. Her hand hovering would feel like permission or accusation. In the ledger, a margin line repeated, 3 rings, a pause, then the house lights dim. Someone had annotated the margin in a hurried sprawl. We stopped telling stories. It listens better. The phrasing read like code or a confession. Mara tried to imagine what it might be. An old fear, a municipal flaw, a habit of the night. She thought of the people who had left, the unclaimed houses, the times when the bell did not bother to finish its toll. The town's quiet began to feel less like absence and more like purposeful containment. A family whose children had grown left a porch light on every night after an October blackout 2 years prior. They told Mara that the glow felt like a small errand of kindness, as though keeping that eye lit was a way to remind the dark there were still people awake. Others turned their lamps off on purpose, a counter-ritual, as if dark matters could be negotiated with light. The town's practices felt like a language with dialects. Some whispered, some were shouted, but all were attempts to get the dark to behave. Mara dreamed the ledger that week, its pages buttered with rain, ink forming shapes that were simultaneously architectural and biological. She woke certain she had read the town wrong for years, that the lights were not mere conveniences, but parts of a pact. The ledger's entries read less like records than rituals. Dates, bell hours, lights left on or extinguished. She began to count the ring patterns against the town's calendar, as if she were learning a new grammar. The more she noticed, the more the town's hush felt directed at her awareness. On the last night of her stay, Mara stood at the power box again. There was no cinematic confrontation, no monster with teeth, no scream, only the ledger's blunt, sticky sentences and her hand hovering over a breaker. She thought then of the phrase in the margin, "We put it to sleep." She imagined sleep not as peace, but as restraint. If the town set a thing to sleep by learning the right cadence of dark and bell, then flipping the breaker might be an unkind mercy, or it might be the moment a long-held habit unraveled. She could not tell which felt worse. She pressed the switch, not with a dramatic flourish, only with the careful finger of someone adjusting an old watch. Everything that had been practiced and patient shifted. Lights returned in a ripple-like breath. Houses blinked awake. The bell finished a toll somewhere down the slope. In In the new glow, window silhouettes resolved into sleepy shapes, curtains drawing as people remembered themselves. For a moment, the town read as ordinary, like a photograph that had finally developed. Then Mara saw, in the ledger's margin, a new, fresh line of handwriting she had not noticed before. Now they remember. The ending is a matter of angles. Some residents smiled and closed doors, glad to relearn the comforting clatter of electric life. Others watched the street with the narrowed patience of those who have seen a boundary rearrange. Mara left the town at dawn, the ledger wrapped, and the camera shutter quiet. When she looked back, Crimson Hill kept its silhouette. Bell, hill, small houses like teeth in a gentle jaw. She could not tell whether she had undone a precaution or interrupted a peace. The record in her bag did not answer. It only added one more notation into the margins of a town that continues to practice listening to its own silences.